I have unrolled the map again. The same map. The old parchment, the amber edges, the ink that knows things it has no right to know, the coastlines that almost match our own, and yet do not quite, the cities marked in careful script, each one named, none of them findable on any modern atlas. I have been coming back to this map for some time now, each visit taking me to a different part of it. The first time, I found myself drawn to the edges of the oceans, to the cities that the water had taken, the ones that slipped beneath the surface and became legend, the grief of those cities, the way the sea closed over them without apology or explanation. The second time, I found a different kind of darkness, a section where the ink seemed less certain, the cities less fixed, always moving just beyond where the last expedition had looked. Cities made of gold, or the idea of gold, which amounts to the same thing when the idea is powerful enough to send armies across an ocean. That section left a weight in me that took some time to lift. Tonight, I am looking at a part of the map I have been circling for a while, unsure how to approach it. It is different from the others. That is the first thing I notice every time I come to it. The other sections of the map are dense with detail. Coastlines carefully rendered, cities named and positioned, rivers marked with the particular care of someone who has followed them. This section is mostly empty. Great expanses of parchment with almost nothing on them. No coastlines, no rivers, just space. Vast, unmarked, the color of the parchment itself, which is the color of sand. And at the edges of that emptiness, almost as an afterthought, a handful of cities, marked more lightly than the others, as though the cartographer's hand hesitated, as though they were not entirely sure these places belonged on a map at all, or whether a map was even the right instrument for finding them. I have been looking at that empty space for a long time now, and I have come to understand something about it. It is not empty. The cartographer left it blank because the desert resists description, because the tools we use to render a place, coastlines, rivers, roads, the geometry of human settlement, are the tools of a world that has water in it, and the desert has almost none. The desert operates by different rules. It has its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own relationship with time and visibility, and the boundary between what is real and what is imagined. You cannot map the desert the way you map a coastline. The desert maps itself in ways that only become legible when you have been inside it long enough. Tonight, I want to take you inside it, not to a single city, not to a single story, but to the desert itself, what it is, what lives in it, what it has swallowed and what it has preserved and what it has shown. To those patient enough to look, at the very edge of seeing, the cities are there. You can see them if you look at the map at the right angle, in the right light. Small marks at the edges of all that emptiness. We will get to them in time. But first I want to tell you about the desert. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. 9 million square kilometers of rock and sand and wind, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania to the Red Sea coast of Egypt, from the Mediterranean in the north to the Sahel in the south. If you placed it over Europe, it would cover the continent entirely, with room to spare. Those are the facts. They are accurate, and they are almost entirely useless for understanding what the desert is. The desert is not a quantity of sand. It is not a measurement of temperature or rainfall or the absence of vegetation. It is something that happens to the human mind and the human body when they are placed inside a landscape that operates by rules different from the ones they were built for. When the horizon is not an edge, but a continuation. When the silence is not the absence of sound, but a presence in its own right, a weight, a texture. When the heat is not weather, but atmosphere, something you exist inside rather than something that happens to you. People who have crossed the Sahara, who have spent days or weeks inside it rather than flying over it, describe it in ways that do not resemble the descriptions of other landscapes. They speak of a quality of attention it produces, a stripping away. The desert removes, steadily and without negotiation, everything that is not essential. Comfort goes first, then familiarity, then, eventually, the ordinary sense of where the self ends and the world begins. What remains after the desert has taken what it takes is something that is either terrifying or clarifying, depending on the person and the moment, sometimes both simultaneously. The pre-Islamic peoples of Arabia understood this. They had been living beside the desert and inside it for longer than recorded history reaches, and they had developed a relationship with it that was not the relationship of people who found it empty or hostile, or simply an obstacle between one habitable place and another. For them, the desert was a world, a fully inhabited, fully meaningful world, governed by presences that the daytime eye could not see and the rational mind could not quite contain. The desert was alive, not metaphorically, literally, specifically, dangerously alive, full of beings that moved through it alongside the human travelers, that watched from the spaces between things, that could be encountered at crossroads and ruins, and the particular quality of darkness that falls in the desert at the moment between dusk and full night. The desert breathes. The temperatures that seem to make it inhospitable are also what make it extraordinary. The expansion and contraction of rock and sand with the movement of heat produces sounds, actual sounds, that carry across the silence. Rocks crack, sand shifts. The desert makes noise in the night that sounds, to the human ear shaped by evolution, to detect threat, like breathing, like movement, like something paying attention. The mirages that the desert produces in daylight, the lakes that appear on the horizon, the cities that shimmer into existence above the sand and then dissolve when approached, are not illusions in the dismissive sense of that word. They are real optical phenomena produced by the way heat bends light. What the eye sees is genuinely there in the physics of the atmosphere. It is simply not where the body can reach it. The desert offers a vision of water that is real and unreachable simultaneously. It is very good at this, at offering things that exist just beyond the boundary of the graspable. And then there are the sounds that the early Arabic sources describe, and that Marco Polo would later describe crossing Central Asian deserts, and that desert travelers across cultures and centuries have reported consistently enough that the consistency itself demands attention. Voices, music, the sound of a caravan, bells and footsteps, and the particular rhythm of camels moving, heard from somewhere in the empty distance. The reports are remarkably similar across vast distances of time and geography. a sound that seems to come from behind you, that draws you off the path, that leads you towards something that is not there when you arrive. The desert, in other words, does things to perception that no other landscape quite replicates. It produces visions. It produces sounds. It produces the unshakable sense of being watched by something that has not decided yet whether it wishes you well. This is not superstition, or rather, it is superstition, in the oldest and most accurate sense of that word, which simply means the things that stand above ordinary experience, the things that exceed what the daily rational mind can account for. The desert exceeds the daily rational mind. That is one of the things it is for. Long before Islam came to the Arabian Peninsula, the desert had its inhabitants. Not human inhabitants, or not only human. The pre-Islamic Arabs understood the desert to be shared space, shared between the tribes with their camels and their poetry and their intricate codes of honor, and the beings that existed in the wild places, the desolate places, the spaces between oases that no tribe claimed and no human authority governed. These beings were the djinn. The word has come down to us, filtered through centuries of Western storytelling, into something almost unrecognizable from what it originally described. The genie in the lamp, the wish granter, the blue comedian. These are the residue of a long process of domestication applied to something that was never domestic. The original jinn were not servants. They were not trapped in lamps waiting for a human hand to free them. They were the nymphs and satyrs of the desert, wild, ancient, possessed of their own societies and their own concerns, occasionally intersecting with human life, but not organized around it. They were made, the tradition says, of smokeless fire. Not flesh, not spirit in the purely immaterial sense, but something between, a substance that has heat and movement and intention, but no fixed form. They predate humanity in the Islamic cosmological account. They were created before humans, given the earth before humans, and some of them have never fully accepted the subsequent arrangement. They have free will, which makes them capable of both great good and great harm. They have communities, families, cities of their own, invisible, existing in parallel to the human world, occasionally overlapping with it at the edges. The edges are important. The jinn do not, in the original tradition, inhabit the places where human life is organized and maintained. They inhabit the threshold places, the ruins of abandoned settlements, where human life was and no longer is. The crossroads, where directions multiply and certainty dissolves. The empty space between one oasis and the next. The hours of travel, where there is nothing on either side, and the path is only a direction rather than a road. The moment just before dawn, when the night is not quite over and the day has not quite begun. They inhabit, in other words, the desert. The early Arabic poets, the pre-Islamic poets whose work survived in collections and whose cultural authority was enormous, often describe their inspiration as coming from a jinn. The poet's particular jinn would visit him in the desert at night and whisper the verses into his ear. This was not considered metaphor. It was considered an accurate account of where poetry came from the wild places, from the beings who lived in the wild places, passed across the border between their world and ours, through the particular permeability of the desert night. When Islam came, it did not erase the jinn. It incorporated them, The Quran acknowledges their existence explicitly. There is an entire surah, the 72nd, called al-Jinn, in which a group of jinn hear the Quran being recited and convert to Islam. They are real in Islamic theology. They are created beings, subject to judgment like humans, capable of faith or faithlessness. What Islam changed was not their existence but their status. They were no longer vague, semi-divine powers of the wild. They were creatures with souls, accountable, part of the same moral order as humanity. But the older understanding persisted beneath the theological framework, the way older understandings always persist beneath newer ones. The jinn of folk tradition remain what they had always been: unpredictable, powerful, deeply connected to the desert and its wild places, neither fully trustworthy nor simply malevolent. They could help, they could harm, they could be neither, simply present, watching, with the particular quality of attention that the desert itself seems to possess. There is a town in Oman called Bahla. It sits in the desert interior of the Omani Peninsula, surrounded by the dramatic Hajar Mountains, an ancient oasis settlement of palm groves and mud brick houses that has been inhabited for thousands of years. Bahla has a reputation. It has had a reputation for as long as anyone in the region can remember. And the reputation is this: Bahla belongs to the jinn. The stories told about Bahla are specific and persistent. The Great Wall that surrounds the town, 13 kilometers of it, an extraordinary feat of construction, is said to have been built in a single night by the jinn, who completed in darkness what no human workforce could have accomplished in years. There are stories of phantom fires seen in the desert around the town, flames that burn without fuel and disappear when approached. Stories of sandstorms that appear from a clear sky, specifically around Bahla, animated and purposeful in a way that weather should not be. Stories of buildings that seem to have been constructed by forces that left no human trace. Some Omanis still will not visit Bahla after dark. Not because they are unintelligent or unmodern. Bahla is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has a museum. It receives tourists. But because the stories are old enough and consistent enough and specific enough that dismissing them entirely requires a certainty about the nature of reality that the desert has a way of undermining. I think about Bahla when I think about what the jinn actually represent in the tradition that produced them. Not supernatural intervention in a world that would otherwise operate by purely natural rules, but the acknowledgement that the world contains more than what is visible, more than what is nameable, more than what fits inside the categories we have built for containing our experience. The desert is the place where those categories become unreliable. The jinn are what lives in the space where the categories fail. They are present throughout everything I am about to tell you. We may not always see them, but they are there. There is a city mentioned in the Quran, not described at length. The Quran is not a book of descriptions, it is a book of truths, but named and placed, and given a fate. The city is Iram, the people are the art, and the fate is this: the desert swallowed them. The story, as the Quran tells it, and as the later traditions elaborated, begins with a people of extraordinary power. The Odd were among the earliest of the ancient peoples, inhabiting a territory in the southern Arabian Peninsula. somewhere in what is now Yemen or Oman, or the vast empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, the Rub al-Khali, the quarter of emptiness. They were giants, some traditions say, not metaphorically, but literally, people of unusual size and strength, which is the way ancient traditions often describe people who were simply more capable than ordinary men. They built with a scale that ordinary people could not match. Their city, Iram, was a wonder. The name given to it in the Quran is Iram dat al-Imad, Iram of the pillars. The pillars are its defining feature in every account. Columns of extraordinary height, reaching toward the sky in a way that seemed to its builders an appropriate gesture toward the divine. A city that aspired upward. A city that believed its own magnificence was a kind of argument. Proof that its people deserved what they had, that their power was justified by their achievement. You will recognize the shape of what comes next. The Ad were warned. A prophet was sent to them, Hud, one of the lesser known of the Quranic prophets, but one of particular significance in the Arabian tradition, because he was sent specifically to the Arabic people, not to another nation whose story had been imported. Hud told the Ad what prophets always tell the powerful, that their power was not theirs, that it had been given, and that the giving could be reversed, that the pillars reaching toward the sky were reaching towards something that had not been consulted about the reaching. The Ad did not listen. They had been building for too long and building too well to believe that what they had built could be taken. The city was there. The pillars were there. The evidence of their greatness was visible from a great distance in every direction. What could undo this? The wind came. Not an ordinary wind. The Quran describes it as a wind of 7 nights and 8 days. Continuous, relentless. A wind that did not stop and did not vary and did not offer the pauses that ordinary weather offers. A wind that came from the desert and went back to the desert and took the Ad with it. By the time it ended, the people were gone. The city was gone. The pillars that had reached so confidently toward heaven were gone. The desert had reclaimed everything. The way the desert reclaims everything it decides to reclaim. Completely, without evidence of struggle, leaving almost nothing to say that anything had ever been there. Iram became, in Arabic tradition, the Atlantis of the sands, the great lost city, the city of impossible achievement, swallowed by the desert as punishment for the sin of forgetting what achievement is for. Explorers and treasure hunters across the centuries pointed at one location or another. Somewhere in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, where the dunes are among the tallest in the world and the silence is among the deepest. The empty quarter is the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, nearly as large as France, and almost entirely unexplored until the 20th century. Whatever is in it has not been asked to reveal itself. In 1992, a team of archaeologists announced that they had found it, or found something, using satellite imagery to identify buried structures beneath the sand of Dhofar in Oman. They had located a site called Ubar, an ancient city, buried at the crossing point of several ancient incense trade routes. When they excavated, they found an octagonal fortress with towers, pottery dating back 4,000 years, evidence of long habitation and sudden, catastrophic abandonment. The city had not been buried by sand. It had fallen into itself. The limestone caverns beneath it had collapsed, taking the city down in what must have been a moment of extraordinary violence and terror. Whether Uba is Iram, whether the Ad were the people who built and lost this place, no one can say with certainty. The scholars are cautious. The site is real and significant, and its abandonment is dramatic and still not fully explained. But the connection to the Quranic account is suggestive rather than proven. The desert keeps its secrets with a thoroughness that makes certainty difficult. What stays with me about Iram is not the archaeology, it is the wind. 7 nights and 8 days, continuous. The Quran gives it that specific duration because duration is the thing. Not a catastrophe that arrives and ends, but a catastrophe that simply continues, that outlasts the ability to hope it will stop, that takes everything in the same patient, unstoppable way that the desert itself takes things, grain by grain, hour by hour, until there is nothing left but sand. The desert, here, is not the setting for the punishment. The desert is the punishment. The wind that came for the Ad was the desert's own breath, turned against the people who had forgotten that they were guests in a landscape that does not require their presence and will continue without them. It is continuing. Out there, in the empty quarter, beneath dunes that shift each season and reveal and conceal in their own time, the desert is continuing, patient as it has always been, keeping what it has decided to keep. There is a book. It has many names. In Arabic, it is Alf Layla wa Layla, 1,000 Nights and a Night. In the West, it became the Arabian Nights, a title that flattens something vast and strange into something that sounds like an entertainment. It is an entertainment, among other things, but it is also one of the great works of world literature, a collection of stories that accumulated over centuries, drawing from Persian and Indian and Arabic and Egyptian sources, growing and changing with each retelling, each translation, each new cultural context it passed through. The frame that holds all the stories together is itself a story. A king named Shahryar, who has been betrayed by his wife, decides that all women are faithless. His solution is this: he will take a new wife each night and have her executed at dawn, before she has time to betray him. He does this for a long time. The kingdom runs out of women willing to marry him, and the vizier, whose job it is to find each new bride, is running out of options. The vizier has a daughter named Scheherazade. She volunteers. Her father is horrified. She insists. On the wedding night, she begins to tell the king a story. It is a very good story. And at the moment that would naturally be its end, the moment of resolution, of completion, of the narrative arriving at its destination, she stops. Not because she has run out of story, because she has planned the stopping. She has left the story at exactly the point where the king cannot bear not to know what happens next. He spares her. One night, she tells him another story. She stops again at exactly the right moment. He spares her again. This continues for 1,000 nights, and one night, 3 years of stories, each one stopping at the edge of its own completion, each one buying one more dawn. By the end, the king has been changed by the stories, by what they have shown him of human life, human love, human failing, human possibility. He puts down the sword. He keeps his wife. Scheherazade saved herself with narrative, with the understanding that a story told well enough stopped at exactly the right moment, is more powerful than a sword. The collection she tells across those 1,000 nights is an extraordinary thing. Stories nested inside stories. Characters who begin telling stories to other characters, who begin telling stories in turn. The whole thing spiraling outward and inward simultaneously in a way that feels less like a book and more like a mind in the act of thinking. It contains adventure and romance and comedy and horror and philosophy and the particular quality of strangeness that belongs to stories that have been told and retold across enough cultures and enough centuries to have shed everything that was not essential and kept only what is. Among its strangest and most beautiful stories, less well known than Sinbad, less celebrated than Aladdin, but in some ways the most haunting of all of them, is the story of the city of brass. It begins in Damascus, in the court of the Caliph Abd al-Malik, who rules from a palace of considerable comfort and hears one evening a story that disturbs his sleep. The story is about King Solomon, who in Islamic tradition was given dominion over not only the human world, but the jinn, who could command them and bind them. Solomon had imprisoned rebellious jinn in vessels of copper, sealed them inside with his royal seal, thrown them into the sea. And the Caliph has been told that some of these vessels are still out there, washing up on distant shores, their seals intact, their jinn still inside after all the centuries. He wants to see one. He wants to witness with his own eyes a jinn released from one of Solomon's vessels, wants to see what emerges, wants to hear what it says. And so he sends an expedition. The expedition is led by a man named Musa ibn Nusayr, and it travels not east into Arabia, but west into Africa, across the Maghreb, into the Sahara. The destination is somewhere in the deep desert, far beyond the last inhabited place, where the vessels are said to be found. The journey takes months. The landscape grows increasingly strange. And then, in the middle of the desert, where there should be nothing at all, the expedition finds something. A city. It is enormous. Its walls are of black stone, its gates of brass. A dark, gleaming brass that catches the desert light in a way that makes the city visible from a great distance, a way that should be welcoming and is instead deeply unsettling. The walls are so high that the expedition circles the city for days before finding the gate, and on the gate, inscribed in stone, is a warning, a poem. The poem says, "We were here, we were great, we are gone, learn from us." They enter. What they find inside is the most extraordinary detail in the whole story, and the detail that has haunted readers for 1,000 years. The city is not ruined. It is not abandoned in the sense of having been left empty. No furniture overturned. No sign of hurried departure. No evidence of the violence or disease or famine that empties cities. The city is perfectly intact and perfectly populated. The people are still there, at their posts, at their tables, in the market stalls, with their hands still extended as though completing a transaction that stopped mid-gesture. The guards at the gate stand guard, hands on their swords, eyes open, looking at nothing. In the palace, the king sits on his throne, dressed in his finest, surrounded by his court. In the inner chamber, a queen lies on a bed of extraordinary richness, dressed as though for a ceremony, her eyes closed, her jewelry still in place. They are not sleeping. They are not statues. They are dead, preserved by the desert air in the perfect, terrible stillness. of people who died in an instant, mid-action, without warning or preparation. A city of the dead that looks like a city of the living. A city that death entered so completely and so suddenly that it left everything in place. On the Queen's tomb, for tomb it is, the Knights makes clear, despite its appearance, there is an inscription. It reads, "If any creature could attain eternal life, Solomon the son of David would have done so. But he did not, and neither shall you." The expedition takes what it came for, the brass vessels found in the palace vaults, their seals intact, the djinn still inside after centuries of imprisonment. They leave the city as they found it, the dead at their posts, the guards at the gate, the Queen on her bed, the brass walls catching the light. I have thought about the city of brass for a long time, and what I keep returning to is not the horror of it, though there is horror in it. The clean, cold horror of a story that knows exactly what it is doing. But the question it asks about the desert, because the city of brass could not exist anywhere else. It requires the desert, the preservation of the dead in their perfect stillness, the way the city looks like it is alive when it is not. These are desert phenomena. The desert air, so dry that it prevents the decay that would otherwise make the truth visible, that would distinguish the dead from the living in the way we expect them to be distinguished. The desert is what makes the illusion possible. The city of brass is the desert's mirror. It shows us the thing we most want to deny, that the line between living and not living is thinner than it appears, that what looks like life can be death, perfectly preserved, that the desert, which we call dead because it does not support our kind of life, may simply be alive in a way we have not learned to read. The djinn in their sealed vessels, waiting in the palace vaults, survived where the people did not. They were made of smokeless fire, not flesh. The desert could not touch them. Some of them, the story implies, are still there, in the vaults of a city somewhere in the Sahara, in the perfect dark, in their copper vessels, patient as the desert itself, waiting for a hand to break the seal. I want to tell you something about the desert that the previous stories may have obscured. The desert takes. It punishes pride and swallows cities and preserves the dead in the perfect stillness of its dry air, and produces, in the human mind that crosses it, a quality of fear and awe that borders on the sacred. All of this is true, but the desert also gives. The people who have always lived beside the desert, the Tuareg, the Bedouin, the Berber peoples, whose culture and spirituality were shaped by the desert over millennia rather than imposed upon it, have a different relationship with it than the one I have been describing. For them, the desert is not primarily a place of danger or punishment or supernatural terror. It is home. It is the place that made them. And the desert, in their tradition, contains within it a secret. The secret is al-Sahara. The name means simply the oasis of the Sahara. But the place it names is not a simple oasis. It is not a spring in the desert, not a patch of palms around a water source, not the kind of oasis that appears on maps and can be reached by following a known route. Al-Sahara is something else, a place that exists at the intersection of the geographical and the spiritual, a place that the desert reveals only to those who have earned the seeing of it. In the traditions of the desert peoples, al-Sahara is something close to what other traditions call paradise. Not paradise as a reward after death, not a place you reach by dying, but paradise as a place that exists here, now, in the world, in the desert itself, accessible in principle to the living, a garden, an abundance, water in a landscape of thirst, shade in a landscape of fire, green in a landscape of gold. Everything that the desert withholds, gathered in one place and offered freely. But it cannot be found by looking for it. This is the essential quality of al-Sahara, the thing that makes it different from an oasis you can mark on a map. It appears. It is given, not discovered. The desert decides for its own reasons to show it. To the traveler who has crossed enough sand, who has given up enough of what is not essential, who has been stripped by the desert's patient work, down to something honest enough to receive what the desert, at its heart, contains. There is a quality to this that resonates across traditions. The idea of a paradise that exists in the world but cannot be reached by ordinary navigation, that requires not a map but a condition of the self. Kitesh, the Russian city we visited in our first journey, was visible only to those who came to the water with honesty in their hearts. al-Sahara appears only to those who have given the desert what it asks, not as payment, but as transformation. You cannot buy your way to it. You cannot navigate your way to it. You can only become, through the desert's own slow work on you, the kind of person it chooses to show itself to. I find this the most desert-like of all the desert's qualities. The desert is not cruel in this tradition. It is demanding. It takes, yes, relentlessly without sentiment. But what it takes is the surplus, the excess, the things you are carrying that you did not need and would not have put down without being made to. And when enough has been taken, when what remains is something close to essential, the desert offers what it has been holding in reserve all along. Water, green, rest, the garden at the heart of the wilderness. The Tuareg have a saying, or rather, the tradition attributes to them a way of understanding the desert that expresses itself in this form, that the desert is not empty. It is full of what it has kept, the bones of camels and the seeds of plants that have not germinated in 100 years, and the memory of water in the dry riverbeds, and the knowledge of which rock all will give shade at which hour of the afternoon. The desert remembers everything it has ever held, and somewhere in that memory, preserved with the same patient thoroughness that preserves everything else, is the garden, al-Sahara, the oasis at the center of the world's largest desert, given to those who have walked far enough, carried little enough, and arrived at the place where what they need and what the desert offers are finally the same thing. Let that image rest in you for a moment. The garden in the desert, the abundance that the emptiness contains, the thing that is given rather than found. And then there is Zerzura. The name comes from the Arabic zaza, the starling, the small dark bird that moves in flocks and fills the air with a sound that is almost but not quite music. Zerzura means the place of little birds, the oasis of the starlings, and its description in the oldest source that names it, a 15th century Arabic manuscript called the Kitab al-Kanuz, the Book of Hidden Pearls, is this: a white city, like a dove, in the western desert, On its gate, carved in stone, is a bird. In the beak of the bird is a key. Take the key from the beak of the bird. Open the gate. Enter. And there you will find great riches, and a king and a queen sleeping in the innermost chamber. Do not wake them. Take what you find and go. That is the entirety of the description. A white city, a carved bird, a key in its beak, a sleeping king and queen. The instruction, do not wake them, which raises the question of what happens if you do, a question the Book of Hidden Pearls declines to answer. There is something in this description that feels less like a treasure hunter's guide and more like a dream. The white city like a dove, the bird that holds the key, the sleepers at the center who must not be disturbed. It has the internal logic of a dream, completely coherent on its own terms, resistant to the kind of interrogation that daylight and reason prefer to conduct. Zerzura appears again in an 1835 account by a British Egyptologist named John Gardner Wilkinson, who recorded a report from an Arab camel herder who claimed to have found it, not the city exactly, but an oasis abounding in palms and springs and ruins of uncertain date, 5 days west of the known oases of the Western Desert. Wilkinson named it Zerzura from the older accounts, and noted its location as precisely as a report from a camel herder about a place he had visited once, while lost in a sandstorm, could be noted. Which is to say, not very precisely at all. But the name entered the imagination of the European explorers who were beginning to map the Sahara in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And once a name enters that kind of imagination, it does not easily leave. Zerzura became what Iram had been for earlier seekers, the destination that justified the journey, the thing just beyond the next dune, the proof that the desert contained more than the desert appeared to contain. By 1930, the obsession had organized itself into a club. The Zerzura Club was founded in a bar in the Sudanese town of Wadi Halfa by a group of British and European desert explorers who had been making expeditions into the Libyan desert and had, between them, found most of the unknown oases that the older accounts had mentioned, all of them except Zerzura. They agreed, over whatever they were drinking in Wadi Halfa that evening, to make it their collective purpose. 13 members. A shared goal. The white city. The carved bird. The key in its beak. Among the members was a Hungarian count named Laszlo Almasi. He had come to the desert in the way that certain people come to the desert, not on the way to somewhere else, but as a destination in itself, as the answer to a need he could not articulate in the language of ordinary life. He was a pilot, which was useful because the Sahara is easier to read from the air than from the ground, the desert's large-scale patterns becoming legible only when you have enough altitude to see them. He flew a de Havilland gypsy moth over the Gilf Kabir, a plateau in the remote southwest corner of Egypt along the Libyan border, and what he found from the air changed what the expedition was looking for. He found valleys, wadis, the Arabic term for the dry riverbeds that cross the desert, which carry water only when it rains, which in the Gilf Kabir happens perhaps once in a decade. But these wadis were different. They showed from the air signs of vegetation, not the scrub that appears at the edges of the desert, but actual green, the suggestion of water, or recent water, or the memory of water in the rock and the soil. the suggestion of the kind of place that might once have been described as an oasis abounding in palms. Al-Masih believed he had found Zerzura. Or rather, he believed he had found what Zerzura was. Not a city, but a system of valleys in the Gilf Kabir that formed a rain oasis, filling briefly when infrequent storms came, and then drying back to near nothing. Not white walls and a carved bird and a sleeping king and queen, but something real and rare and hidden until you were directly above it. He reported this finding with the cautious pride of a man who knows he has found something significant, but is not entirely sure he has found the thing he was looking for. Ralph Bagnold, who had founded the Zerzura Club, and who was, by his own account, more skeptical than Al-Masih about the literal existence of a white city, accepted the finding as a reasonable conclusion to the search. The club continued to meet, and its members continued to explore. But the specific quest for Zerzura as a place was effectively over, except that in finding the wadis of the Gilf Kabir, Al-Masih had found something else. Something that was not what he was looking for, and was, in its way, more extraordinary than what he was looking for. In one of the valleys, a wadi he called Wadi Surah, the Valley of Pictures, there was a cave, and on the walls of the cave, painted in ochre and black, and the colours of rock and time, were people. People swimming, not standing, not hunting, not performing any of the activities that prehistoric cave art typically depicts. Swimming, arms extended, legs trailing, bodies suspended in the way that bodies are suspended only in water. Dozens of them, painted with a specificity and a care that spoke of people who knew what swimming looked like, because swimming was something they did regularly as part of a life that included the presence of abundant water. In the middle of the Sahara, on the walls of a cave in a desert that receives perhaps 1 centimeter of rainfall a year, people swimming. The implications took time to absorb, and are still being absorbed. What the Cave of the Swimmers, as it became known because the name is inescapable, tells us is this: the Sahara was not always a desert. As recently as 5,000 years ago, the region that is now the most arid place on Earth was a different place entirely. A savanna, a grassland with rivers and lakes, a place where people lived in communities, herded cattle, painted their lives on cave walls, in the confident expectation that the world would continue to resemble the world they knew. And then the climate shifted. It shifts. It has always shifted. Will always shift, on timescales that dwarf human history. The rains moved south. The rivers dried. The lakes became salt flats and then became sand. The people moved or died, or became the ancestors of the peoples who have always lived at the desert's edge, carrying in their traditions the memory of a world before the desert that is now so old it no longer looks like memory. The Cave of the Swimmers preserved what the desert took, as it preserves everything it takes, completely, without decay, in its cold, dry dark. The swimmers are still there, on the cave wall, arms extended, in the water that has not existed around them for 5,000 years. Al-Masih went looking for a white city with a key in a bird's beak. He found instead the proof that the desert was not always the desert, that beneath the sand and the silence and the apparent emptiness, there is another world, an older world, a wetter world, a world in which the thing that is now absence was once abundance. The desert is not empty, it is full of what it has kept. And what it has kept, here, in this cave, in this valley, on this plateau, in this vast and patient silence, is a vision of people at home, in a world that no longer exists, moving through water, unhurried, unafraid, alive in a way that the desert, 5,000 years later, allows us to see, perfectly, completely, in the colours that have not faded because nothing has touched them, only because it kept them. That is what Zerzura was, in the end. Not a city, not a treasury, not a sleeping king and queen in an innermost chamber, but this, people swimming in a world before the desert came, the oasis of little birds, singing in a Sahara that was once a meadow, preserved on a cave wall in the silence that followed. The key was always in the bird's beak. The gate was always open. We just had to learn to read what the desert was showing us. I am rolling the map up. This section is different in my hands from the others, lighter in some ways. There is less ink here, less detail, more space. The great emptiness of the parchment that I noticed when I first turned to this part of the map, but heavier in another sense. Heavier with what the emptiness contains, what the sparseness of the markings conceals. Because I understand now why the cartographer left most of this section blank. Not because there was nothing to mark, but because the desert resists the kind of marking that maps require. The desert's contents are not fixed. The djinn move through it invisibly. Iram is buried under sand that shifts with every season. The city of brass stands somewhere in the Sahara, perfectly preserved, its dead at their posts, its brass walls catching a light that no one is currently there to see. War al-Sahara appears and disappears according to its own logic. And Zerzura, the white city, the oasis of the little birds, turned out to be not a city at all, but a world, an older world, held in the walls of a cave by the desert's extraordinary talent for keeping what it takes. What stays with me, after every time I look at this section of the map, is the swimmers, the people in the cave of the swimmers, painted in ochre on the walls of a valley, in a desert that was once a lake. The specificity of them, not symbols, not abstractions, but people with arms and legs and the particular quality of motion that belongs to a body moving through water. Someone painted them who knew them, who saw them swimming and thought, this should be remembered, this should be kept. The desert kept it. 5,000 years of keeping in the cold dark of a cave in the Gilf Kabir, while the water that had made the painting possible retreated south, and the sand moved in, and the world above the cave became the world above the cave. The swimmers remained, arms extended, in the water that had left them. The desert is not dead. It never was. It is a different kind of living, slower, older, operating on timescales that make human history look like an afternoon. It breathes, it shifts, it takes and keeps, and occasionally, to those who have crossed enough of it and given up enough in the crossing, it gives something back, a vision of water in a waterless place, a garden at the heart of the emptiness, a cave full of swimmers in a desert that has not been a lake for 5,000 years. The djinn are still there, in the wild places between the oases, in the ruins of cities that the wind took and the sand covered. Bahla still has its stories, its phantom fires, its wall that the djinn built in a single night. Iram is still somewhere in the empty quarter, beneath the dunes. The wind that took it long since settled back into the ordinary desert wind that takes nothing, and nothing, and nothing, and then, one day, everything. The city of brass stands in its perfect, terrible stillness. It's dead at their posts. The brass vessels in the palace vault, the inscription on the queen's tomb catching the light that comes through the gate each morning and illuminating its warning to no one. And the swimmers are on the cave wall. They will be there long after the map has crumbled and the stories have changed shape again. And the desert has become, once more, something that a future people will need a new set of words to describe. Let the desert settle into you now. Not the fear of it, not the scale of it, but the quality of it. The silence that is not empty, the dark that preserves, the patience that outlasts everything it encounters, and asks only that you give up what you do not need and keep moving and trust that the desert knows, as it has always known, exactly what it is doing. Let the sand be still. Let the djinn go about their business in the wild places, in the spaces between things, in the dark that is full of presences you cannot quite see. Let the swimmers swim in the water that is not there, on the wall of the cave in the valley, on the plateau in the desert that is full of everything it has ever held. You are warm. You are still. The desert keeps its secrets well. Sleep now. Sleep.